As we begin our second discussion, second group of organisms we're going to talk about in detail, I just want to do a quick reminder about the nature of evolution. Oftentimes, once a group gains new abilities, so they evolve, they adapt, they get new features that allow them to do very, very well, they become diverse, and sometimes they can dominate for hundreds of millions of years. Dinosaurs are one of those groups. Going all the way back to the Paleozoic and then throughout the entire Mesozoic era, which spans a range of about 200 million years, they were the dominant terrestrial organisms. There were big herbivores, small herbivores, big carnivores, small carnivores, everything in between. They were dominant in those environments. And there were other organisms around, but really they were the big common organisms. At the end of the Cretaceous, there was an extinction. However, not all dinosaurs went extinct, and we've emphasized that point already. So we're going to be talking now about birds. But I just want you to recognize that when we have these big diverse groups, and then some of them go extinct, sometimes we see interesting patterns that can be difficult to discern by only looking at the remnant about what's left. So we need to include the extinct organisms also. So let's look at birds. Now, birds for a long time have been recognized as a very unique and distinct organism. It's something that you really don't need to define for most people, right? They know immediately when you say bird, they know what it is. And any bird I show them, they're going to say, yep, that's a bird, despite how different they are. And the reason birds are so easy to identify is because they have so many synapomorphies. And that's a good vocabulary word. We'll be talking about it more in the coming days. A synapomorphy is a shared ancestral characteristic that all of the descendants still possess. It's a little bit, complicated, but basically it's a feature that is unique to a group and is distinctive. It defines that group. And birds have a lot of them. Some of them are obvious, right? So feathers are the easiest one. If it has feathers, it's a bird, and nothing else has feathers. Another one are these modifications of the forelimbs into wings. And even if they no longer use those forelimbs for flying, they still have that distinct shape. So penguins, ostriches, other flightless birds still have a very distinct wing-like limb, but it's just no longer used for flying. They have hollow bones, which is distinct and unique, particularly when you look at how those hollow bones are formed. They have this very distinct beak, right? They don't have teeth on their mouths. They have beaks that are different shapes, but are all very similar in the way that they are developed and the materials from which they are made out of. They are endothermic, which is really not a true synapomorphy because other organisms are also endothermic. But among the group, and if we get into the very fine details of that endothermy, then that is distinctive for birds. They have a very high metabolic rate, which is another unique feature for them, particularly among the diapsids. They have a large and distinctly formed heart, and they have this very efficient respiratory system that is quite different from yours and mine, which basically acts like a bellows or like a balloon filling up and then releasing the air, whereas theirs has more of a in farther. It's actually two full cycles before the air that came in goes back out, and so that allows them to extract more oxygen from their environment. So all of those, and if you're a bird person, you could even get into some more fine details, but birds are very clearly and distinctly a unique group, and they're all closely related to one another. However, as we've established already, the birds' closest relatives are the theropod dinosaurs. In fact, they are classified as a theropod dinosaur. And so here's a large phylogeny of all of the diversity of dinosaurs. In the silhouettes, you can recognize the sauropods, the long necks. These are the theropod dinosaurs, the two-legged dinosaurs. And then over here we have all of these other dinosaurs, the duck-billed platypus, stegosaurus, triceratops, right? So it was a very diverse and big group. The human and the elephant are modern species. They're here just for size references, right? But there were some very, very big ones, the biggest land animals ever to live. There were very small ones. They could be like small turkey-sized, a little smaller than that even. So a very, very diverse group, and they were a terrestrial group of diapsids. Okay, so here's a little bit more detail of the phylogeny, the relationships among the dinosaurs. And here's our group, aves, birds. Notice that they are more closely related to some of the dinosaurs, the raptors, than they are to the other dinosaurs. Okay, so just make sure that you're aware of that and be familiar with that. Now let's talk in more detail about these theropod dinosaurs. One of the unique things about the theropods is they, fairly early in their history, evolved a bipedal gait. They moved on two legs instead of four legs, which was the most common and the ancestral way for dinosaurs to get around. Now, what this does is it releases a structure, in this case the forelimbs, from an ancestral requirement, right? Which is moving around. You need all four legs to get around if you are most dinosaurs. However, amongst this group, that changed. So their forelimbs were no longer required for supporting their weight and helping them move around. And so we have this structure that was released from its ancestral function. Now, when we have a structure that's no longer used for what it was originally evolved for, there are a couple of different things that can happen, a couple of outcomes. Here's a humorous one. I don't have the link in there, so let me just pull it up here. But in birds, the forelimbs evolved to take on a brand new function, and it was a long process for that evolution to occur. In some groups, they were used for grasping, for grabbing, right? But in other groups, this is what happened, and T-Rex is kind of famous for this.
What's going on? Why aren't you seizing the boy?
So that, of course, is a humorous take on this condition that we're talking about. That comes from a movie, by the way, called Meet the Robinsons. It was a Disney movie, and the bad guy has made a minion out of the T-Rex, and he can't fulfill his job because he has these tiny little arms. In fact, we might even call them vestigial, right? They're a remnant of what was once a very useful structure but is no longer being used for other things. Carnivores and other theropods also had similar conditions to the T-Rex, while others maintain those forelimbs for grasping, maybe even for climbing, and eventually for gliding, and finally true flight in some of the theropod dinosaurs. My daughter had a t-shirt that said, "I hate push-ups," and there's a picture of a T-Rex on it, right? So there's kind of a humorous side to this. But in T-Rex, those arms were almost certainly no longer, they weren't used for the ancestral feature, it may no longer have served any use at all. Okay? Feathers, which we've already mentioned, are maybe the most clear and unique distinctive features of birds. However, as we now know from the fossil record, they are not a unique bird feature. They are really more appropriately a theropod dinosaur feature. Feathers evolved early in the history of the theropod dinosaurs, and although we don't have direct evidence for all of the theropod fossils, because most of them we only have bones for, the ones where we do have additional preservation, like when we get soft tissue preserved, there's always a sign of feathers. So it seems clear that at least at one stage or another of their life, pretty much all theropod dinosaurs had feathers. Now, today's feathers serve a multiple range of functions. So there are three main functions for feathers. There are lots of other smaller ones, but you should know these three main functions. Number one, of course, the one that comes to mind maybe first for most people is flight, right? Feathers are used for flight. Number two, they are used for insulation, right? They help keep birds warm. Number three is they are used to communicate, right? For display to a mate or to a rival, right? Bright colors or even camouflage, which is kind of a way of trying not to communicate or of blending into your environment, but some sort of display feature. Now, as we look at the fossil record, there's some fairly clear evidence about which of these modern functions first evolved in feathers and what feathers were first used for. So if you look at feathers in some of the theropods, they covered pretty much their entire body. But the earliest ones had feathers that were very large and distinct, primarily on their head. And so it's thought that feathers most likely evolved initially as a display feature, so that visual communication function. Later, as they became more widespread across the entire body, they could have served as a thermal regulator. And so this would be a theropod dinosaur that is able to stay warm because it has a feather coat, but of course can't fly, right? So feathers first evolved the ability to display and communicate information. Secondly, they also took on the additional function of thermoregulation, insulation to keep heat in. And finally, in the birds only, they evolved the ability for gliding and then eventually true flight. And our modern views of these theropod dinosaurs has changed dramatically. So in Jurassic Park, we have these very scaly, the first Jurassic Park, very scaly, large raptors, which by the way are not velociraptors. The big ones are actually called Utah raptors. Velociraptors were about the size of a turkey and wouldn't have been that scary. But there were big raptors like that, but they are almost certainly covered in feathers, which is not depicted correctly in the movie. And they kind of in Jurassic World reverted back to the original. Maybe it's because people had a lot invested, but it's a very inaccurate picture of Velociraptor. This actually here is an artist's interpretation of a raptor, one of these organisms from the Velociraptor group. And even our famous T-Rex most likely had feathers, maybe only at a juvenile stage. This is an artist's interpretation of a juvenile T-Rex. They may very well have had feathers at a later stage also. Not feathers for flying, but for thermoregulation. And there's even been some speculation that there might be regional variation, like there are in some modern species, where in the north their coats would have been different. They would have had different color patterns than perhaps in the south. Now, a lot of this is still just speculation, but it's because we don't have direct data. Most of these structures don't preserve well in the fossil record. But certainly feathers are a theropod dinosaur feature that birds evolved to the fullest extent. And modern birds have feathers of all different shapes and sizes. They have some that are still for thermal regulation. Many birds have feathers that are for display. And of course, the flying birds have these primary flight, secondary flight feathers, these large feathers that provide the surface for lift when they are flying. Now, let's go through a list of bird ancestors. Many of these have the word pteryx in their name, so they're easy to remember. That's the Greek root word for wing. So Archaeopteryx means the ancient wing. This is a fossil going back 150 million years ago. So this is right in the time when the dinosaurs were doing really, really well. Again, just one of many, many diverse dinosaurs at the time was Archaeopteryx. And it had many features that clearly mark it as a early bird, right? And there's some distinctions whether you would call this a bird or not, maybe not until later on that you finally make that distinction. But it could fly, although it probably took a lot of effort and energy, like maybe modern chickens or chachalakas or other ground-dwelling birds that can fly but have to really put a lot of energy into it. Probably lived in forest, was a hunter, a predator. It had teeth still, though. It had legs that were much more like the ancestral theropod rather than modern birds. There were many differences. It had large claws on its forelimbs still, despite having the wings. And this came from a fossil discovered in Germany. There have been several other intact fossils that have fine enough preservation that we can see the outline of these feathers. Now, I'm just going to hit highlights. Recently, especially over the last decade, there have been hundreds of new fossils that have been found from dozens of species that are helping us to fill out the picture, some with incredibly fine preservation of soft tissue, like this species from China. So Confucius ornis, ornis is the Greek root for bird, and Confucius is to pay tribute to the philosopher from China, which is where this bird was found. But notice that now we have many more bird features, and you look and say, yeah, it's a bird, but then you look closely, oh, it's a little different. It still has large claws on its wings. It has some rudimentary teeth still in its beak. But we're beginning to evolve and change and gain the features that we recognize in modern birds. Caudopteryx was a ground dweller with gliding wings, most likely, and more pronounced claws 125 million years ago. At 120 million years ago, we begin to see more and more bird-like features. This looks maybe like a modern jay, but again, with some features that are still a little bit ancestral. They've got still some small teeth in the beak. Modern birds have lost all remnants of those, and they still have claws on the wings. Almost all modern birds have lost those claws on their wings, but they persisted for many millions of years. There's actually one bird called the Quetzalcoatl that maintains these claws on its wings as juveniles, and the juveniles use them to help hang on and scramble around in the treetops. But most birds have completely lost those. There were aquatic ones, although primarily these were terrestrial and flying, right, in the air. So they were competing at this time, back 85 million years ago and earlier, they were competing for space in those flying niches with the pterosaurs, which were still around and doing very well. But some of them begin to invade a little bit into aquatic niches, and we have birds today that are, although not completely aquatic, like penguins, do very, very well in those aquatic environments.